Nobody asked me what I thought about any of it. That's fine. I'm a librarian. Nobody asks librarians what they think about anything until they can't find the thing they're looking for, and by then it's too late to matter. The Vethaal Cooperative's 43rd summit on the Rel-Kavar Accord had been stalled for 11 days when I arrived at the diplomatic garden. I was the 7th civilian liaison assigned to the Earth delegation in as many weeks. The first 6 had been diplomats, academics, a former senator, and a man who described himself as a cross-cultural systems architect, which, as near as I could tell, meant he owned a lot of linen blazers. None of them had moved the talks forward by a single paragraph. Someone in the diplomatic corps apparently decided that the next step was to try someone with no opinions, no credentials, and no particular reason to be there. That was me. I brought Dot because I didn't know I wasn't supposed to. Dot is a Roborovsky dwarf hamster. She weighs 42 grams on a good day. She is 3 years old, which is old for her kind. And she has the coloring of something that fell out of a sandbox. Pale tan, white-bellied, quick dark eyes. I've had her since she was 6 weeks old. She rides in a small, hard-sided travel carrier that's roughly the size of a hardback novel, with a mesh panel on the front so she can see out. I bring her to work. I bring her to the dentist. I brought her to my mother's funeral and set her on the pew beside me, and nobody said a word, because it was my mother's funeral, and Dot sat very still through most of it. The diplomatic attaché who met me at the transit gate looked at the carrier and said, "That is a containment unit?" I said, "That is a hamster." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is it documented?" I said yes, because I had filed the standard fauna transit form, which asked for species, weight, and vaccination records, and had no field for anything else. He looked at the form. He looked at the carrier. He looked at the form again, and then folded it carefully and put it in his jacket pocket instead of the intake folder, which I thought was a little strange, but I'd been a librarian for 26 years, and I'd learned not to press people about their filing choices. He walked me to the garden without saying anything else. The Rel-Kavar Garden is what they call it. It's a pressurized terrace on the outer ring of the Kesavar Concourse Station, real planted ground, low imported grasses, the kind of pale lavender sky you get through filtered plating on this side of the transit hub. There are benches. There are what I understood to be ceremonially significant stones, though no one explained the ceremony. There are 8 Vethaal Cooperative envoys, and their full support staff, and for 11 days they had been sitting on their side of a long table under a canopy and saying, in precise and measured language, that they were not prepared to ratify Section 14 of the Accord without further review. Nobody on the Earth delegation knew what was wrong with Section 14. I sat down on a bench near the low fence at the garden's edge, which was as far from the table as I could reasonably get without leaving the space entirely. I opened the carrier and let Dot onto my knee. It was mid-morning, station time. The light through the plating was pale and flat. She sniffed my jacket pocket, found nothing, turned in a circle, and settled into the crook of my knee with her nose tucked under her forepaw. I had brought a book. I read it. I don't know exactly when the Vethaal envoy first noticed her. I was on chapter 4. I looked up because the garden had gone quiet in a particular way. Not the polished, deliberate quiet of a negotiation pause, but the sudden quiet of a room where someone has stepped on something they didn't expect to find on the floor. The lead envoy, Javal Khan they called him, tall, the color of old slate, with the secondary respiratory panels that lined his collar ridge, was standing 6 feet away, with his hands folded in front of him and his eyes on my knee. Dot was asleep. She was just asleep. Her sides moved. Her nose twitched once. Her forepaws were tucked under her chin with the delicate economy of something that has no use for anything it isn't currently using. Javal Khan stood there for a while. His respiratory panels were flat against his collar ridge. I didn't know what that meant then. I found out later, from the attaché, that in Vethaal biology, the panels flatten involuntarily in the presence of something the nervous system classifies as requiring sustained attention. They're not volitional. You can't train them out of it. You either flatten or you don't. He flattened. Then he turned and walked back to the table, and the session continued exactly as before. He came back the next morning, and the morning after that. By day 9, 3 of the other envoys were coming with him. They didn't crowd the bench. They stood at a respectful distance, and they were very quiet. Dot ignored all of them. She ate a seed from my palm, turned around, and went back to sleep. One of the junior envoys, a young one I thought, from the way the senior staff barely acknowledged him, made a soft sound that the translation unit on my collar rendered as no known equivalent. I asked the attaché about it later. He said it was a phrase used for things that exist outside the classification system. He said it was old. He said they didn't use it often. I said, "She's a hamster." He said, "Yes." I said, "She's 3 years old, and she's afraid of loud noises, and she prefers sunflower seeds to pumpkin seeds, and she has never done anything significant in her life." He said, "I understand." He didn't argue with me. I thought that was polite of him. On day 11, Vethaal Khan came alone. The session had recessed for the midday interval, and the garden was otherwise empty, except for a groundskeeper trimming the pale grass at the far corner, who paid us no attention. The lead envoy walked to within 2 feet of the bench and stood there for a long time without speaking. Dot had climbed up to my shoulder by then. She was examining the collar of my jacket with focused, unhurried interest, the way she examines everything, not because she expects to find anything, but because examining things is simply what she does. She has been doing it for 3 years. She will do it until she stops. Vethaal Khan watched this for perhaps 4 minutes. Then he made a sound the translator rendered as acknowledgement of something that does not require further action. He went back to the table. On the morning of the 12th day, I arrived at the garden, and the table under the canopy was empty. The support staff were packing equipment cases. The ceremonially significant stones had already been removed. I found the attaché at the garden entrance, with a stack of signed documents and an expression I couldn't read. He said the Vethaal Delegation had completed their review of Section 14. I said, "What changed?" He said he wasn't certain he could explain it in terms I'd find satisfying. I said, "I was a librarian. I had a high tolerance for unsatisfying explanations." He said that the Vethaal Cooperative maintains a category, a very old one, rarely used, for entities that exist in their assessment framework prior to the need for assessment. He said the category had been invoked 14 times in the cooperative's recorded history. He said the delegation had filed the relevant designation the previous evening, and that Earth's transit status had been updated accordingly. He said this was entirely separate from the accord, which had been ratified independently, but that the 2 events occurring in the same week was something the delegation's official record described as contextually consistent. I asked him what entity had been designated. He looked at the carrier in my hand. I said, "She weighs 42 grams. He said, "Yes." I said, "She's afraid of loud noises." He said, "I know." He didn't say anything else. I didn't either. There didn't seem to be much left to say. The transit back to the hub gate took about 20 minutes. I sat in the rear of the diplomatic shuttle with the carrier on the seat beside me and the mesh panel facing the window, so Dot could see the station going by if she wanted to. She didn't want to. She had found a corner of the carrier bedding she apparently found acceptable and had folded herself into it, with her nose under her forepaw and her sides moving slow and even. I turned the transit form over in my hands. Fauna Transit, Standard Issue, Species, Roborovsky Dwarf Hamster, Weight, 42 grams, Vaccinations, Current. There was no field for anything else. I put it back in my bag. The shuttle docked. We went home.